OK, so the next logical step, as we'll see in a moment, fixtures and factories, answers the following problem. What if, it's easy once you learn about mocks to start going mock and stub crazy and step back and look at your tests and realize that all you've done is test a bunch of nothing. And in fact, sometimes what you really need is the real thing. So let's take a look at an example. OK, so what's happening here? The premise of my test setup is I want to test this method called name-with-rating that is supposed to put together the name and the rating of a movie, simplest thing in the world. And what I've done is, oh, I know how to use stubs and mocks. I'll create a stunt double, a mock of the movie. But I know that this name-with-rating method is going to look at the title and rating attributes. So I have to stub specific methods on that mock. This is the longhand way of stubbing them. I create the mock first. And instead of also passing additional parameters of what to stub, I can do it separately. They mean the same thing. But basically, I end up stubbing two things and then calling name with rating. And if I, once my hangover abates and I look at this and say, why didn't I just use a real movie? I mean, it's like it was more work to create this fake object with certain fake behaviors than it would have been to just create a real object and let it use it. So in cases where you need the real thing, the question is, where do you get a real copy of an object? So one thing you can do is you can create a fixture. It's a term that comes from the manufacturing world. And basically, a fixture is a harness that you put a piece of machinery in or a thing that you've manufactured, and you're going to probe it and poke at it and do a bunch of tests. So the fixture is sort of the part that doesn't move, hence the name. And in the SAS world, what it corresponds to is because models tend to live in tables, it means we're going to preload some known data into some of the model tables because we're going to then have tests that expect to find those data objects there. So one possibility in the example I just showed is you could create a couple of movies. You know that they're going to be there. You know what their attributes are. So then when you have some tests, you can rely on the presence of those movies in the database. That's one possibility. The other possibility is a factory, not to be confused with the factory design pattern or the factory method when you are constructing objects of an abstract class. But there is the concept of creating. And the idea is, in a factory, you create only what you need for this test. So if I just had a test that needs a couple of movies, I'll create the movies just in the setup for that test. And as you might have already guessed, RSpec is helpful enough when you run it with Rails apps that if you put stuff in the database that's just comes in, if you create database records that are created within a specific, boy, I'm not articulate today. If you create database records within a specific test case, because that test case needs to use them, it's actually the case that after that test runs, those database records are wiped out. For those of you who are in the database world, what actually happens, in case you're curious, is that each one of the RSpec tests gets run inside a transaction. And once the test finishes, the transaction is rolled back. So you can create a whole mess of temporary data inside one test case. And you can, with high confidence, you can know that that data is going to evaporate when the next test case runs. And that helps keep your tests independent. So that kind of brings up the tension between fixtures and factories. Now, the database is wiped and reloaded before each spec. So if we add this line at the beginning of one of our describe blocks, it basically says, before you run the tests in this block, preload all of the fixtures described in this file. The file is YAML, YML, yet another markup language. Take a look at the form. You've seen YML files already in Rails. They're trivial. But you can basically specify a handful of movies or whatever, and they're going to be loaded into the movies table. Right? Convention over configuration says, as usual, I'll look at the file name, and I'll infer which database table these fixtures are supposed to go in. So you could do that. And the nice thing about it is that now you know what the data is. It never changes. It gets loaded before every test. You can rely on it. On the other hand, you might end up introducing accidental dependencies into your tests. For example, if you've got a test someplace else that has to do with counting the number of movies that match some criterion, if you start adding or subtracting fixtures for other tests, that may affect the counts that would be performed by the tests you don't care about. So the bad side of a fixture is it's sort of there for all the tests, whether you want them to be there or not. As opposed to a factory, where instead what you do is you have some helper methods that make it really easy to create versions of objects that sort of have simple default attributes. You know they're valid. You can create them for each test. And because they're only created inside the test, they're wiped out after each test. And you don't have to worry about independence. So what would this look like? Well, if you're going to do this, don't do it yourself. Find a good library at Gym. I have started to use one called Factory Girl, if I can find it. So here's an example of how you would use Factory Girl to create a factory for movies. In one of my factories definitions, I say, whenever I want to create a default version of a movie, just give it this title, give it this rating, and give it this release date. And on a per instance basis, if I have specific tests where I want to override those, I can certainly do it. But this basically means whenever I need a sort of a real movie object, not a stand-in, but an honest-to-goodness movie, I can just say build, and here's an example of where, in this case, I chose to override the title, because for my own purposes, I need the movie to have a different title. So the idea is you have one place where you put some basic logic that lets you create these objects, and then creating them is sort of a one-liner, right? It's almost as easy as creating a mock version of the object, only you get a real object. And a reason you'd want to do this is, as we'll see when we start doing more complex apps, often there are objects that have relationships among them. So for example, you can imagine that if I have a user or a moviegoer object and I have something like a street address, you can't imagine a moviegoer without a valid street address. So really, when you create a moviegoer, you also have to create these other ancillary objects that go along with them. Factories let you do that pretty easily because you can put all the logic in one place for saying, this is what it means to create a usable version of this object, even if it also involves temporarily creating these other side objects that it's going to use. Or maybe the usable version of an object itself relies on mocks that are set up to do these ancillary jobs. All of those things can be sort of captured in one place in the factory definition. So which one do you use? As I said, one downside of potential downside of factories is if you have complex relationships you have to set up, the factories could get sort of complicated. On the other hand, whenever you find yourself in a situation like that, what it should be telling you is there's something about your code that's not well factored. If doing a simple test requires setting up a lot of complex relationships, there must be a function somewhere that knows way more than it should about all of those relationships. And you should be looking at how to refactor your classes so that they don't have such dense cross-connections. We'll talk about that quite a bit when we talk about refactoring. So how do you know if you've committed one of the blunders of factories versus fixtures? One of my favorite ones is called the mock train wreck. And to motivate it, here's an example of we want to test a hypothetical method that would search for a movie by its director or by the Oscars that it received, by the awards it received. So this is the thing we'd ultimately want to write in our test. But that means that, here's the same test we'd want to check for the name of a director. But if we wanted to put things like this into our test, that means that we have to have a movie object. And the movie object has to be associated with a director object, which has to have a name attribute. So the fact that we're chaining these three things together means that the movie object knows a whole lot about an object that is like its grandchildren, right? So if we wanted to actually set this up, we could mock the award, we could mock what a director is, and then we could mock a movie that has those two things as attributes. And by now, you really should be asking yourself, wait a minute, why is it again, if the award type is an important thing for the movie to know, shouldn't the award object expose that as a first-class attribute, as a first-class getter? And by the way, if it did that, we could just stub that getter directly, right? We wouldn't have to go through this dance of creating a sequence of mocks, hence the name mock train wreck, right? They're all chained together. Because the real problem is that the movie shouldn't know things about its descendants, right? It should know things about awards, but it shouldn't know the subclasses or the attributes of awards. That's sort of too much information. We'll talk about that more when we come back to refactoring, but as a preview, that's called inappropriate intimacy. Movie has no business reaching into award and understanding its internals. Take that any way you wish. So now that you've learned about fixtures and factories, here's a good intuition question. What are examples of kinds of data that should not be set up as fixtures? So which one of these, if any, would not be a good candidate for doing a fixture? Movies and their ratings, the API key for TMDB in the TMDB example we've been doing, or time zone settings for the application, wherever it runs. Would not be a good candidate for fixturing. And of course, why? But